Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Brew Pub. I'm your host, Michael Camp, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. We're with Beth Amodeo, and Beth is an author of the book God's Ex-Girlfriend, a memoir about loving and leaving the evangelical Jesus. Beth, welcome to the Spiritual Brew Pub.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to our conversation. We have a lot in common. You actually are pretty good friends with my niece, who I think you met in New York City, right?
We met upstate actually, which is funny.
Upstate New York. Okay, all
But we
right.
both lived in New York City for a long time.
Right. No, she did it for a long time, and then both of us grew up in Massachusetts. And when you were in college, you got involved with a ministry called Campus Crusade for Christ, and when I was in college, I got involved with the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which was very similar, and I knew a lot of people in Campus Crusade. We
Mhm.
called it Crusade back then, but you call it, what do they call it now?
At this point in time, they're calling it crew because the word
Crew.
crusade wasn't really doing them any favors.
That wasn't right. They finally got the memo on that, right,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, the branding wasn't working. Yeah.
Right. So, the other thing is that we've learned, well, both of us have, deconstructed conservative Christianity and learned a lot of lessons around that. So, you're gonna share a lot of that with us today, and, finally, you are a successful evangelist, it sounds like, from reading your book. And you were in the devil's territory. I mean, New York City, I mean,
Yeah. I was working in a hellhole apparently.
apparently.
All of
And
it, yeah.
so I did something similar. I went off to go work in the enemy's territory, so to speak,
Mhm.
in a Muslim communities in Africa as a missionary. So a lot in common. So why don't we get started and kind of hear some about your background. But I guess before we hear that background and your upbringing and so forth, just give us a reason. Why did you write this book? What's your goal?
So I wrote this book because when I left evangelicalism, I felt like there weren't a lot of stories out there for people who maybe hadn't been raised in it, and had kind of been like drawn into it later on in their lives in sort of these formative years of their lives as I had been. Uh,
Right.
and also, I just felt like there's a need for any and all stories to be told from people who have left evangelicalism. The thing about evangelicalism is when you are in it, you are so afraid of leaving it. And
Hmm.
it feels like everybody who's in it will never leave, and nobody has. And if anybody does leave, they're so ostracized from the community and they're so blocked out of people's lives that they just cease to exist in many ways. And I think that when you do leave evangelicalism, there was a piece of me at least that felt like I had ceased to exist in a lot of ways too. Like my life, I kind of had to start over again. It was there was just a lot of question marks, a lot of blankness in my life, it felt like, after having it been filled with so many people for so long and such a strong ardent belief system that meant so much to me. And I just wanted to write a book that helped people feel like they weren't alone, that could help people through their own deconstruction, especially if they had gotten into it later on in life, but even if they hadn't, even if they grew up in it, and kind of some of the questions that led to my deconstruction they could relate to. But I also wrote it because I really wanted to warn people about this movement and about what happens to people at this age in college, and how there are these sort of nefarious Christian groups on college campuses. And it's like everyone's always like warning you about like sororities and frats, like, oh, these people are going to make you jump into the train tracks and dodge a moving train to enter their sorority or their fraternity.
Right.
But there's a
Right.
lot of warning about, like, college partying and about, like, all of this other stuff when you enter college, but nobody tells you that, you're gonna be pretty emotionally vulnerable. You're gonna enter a time in your life where you're just, like, starting to figure out who you are as an adult and what adulthood even looks like, and that there's gonna be some groups there that are gonna try to take advantage of that in some pretty sneaky ways, and it's gonna, for Campus Crusade at least, and as you read in my book, like it came up on me in some pretty sneaky ways. I wasn't even really sure what I was dealing with when I
Yeah.
started dealing with it.
Right.
So,
Well, that sounds also familiar. I mean, in college. We're in our formative years, and many of us are just not really well grounded. We're just kind of getting into the adult stage, trying to figure things out. And depending on what our upbringing is, we could have a lot of personal psychological issues that we're dealing with.
mhm,
And these kind of groups claim to have all the answers, and we've got it all figured out, we've got God figured out, and there's a promise of peace, etc., if you join the group and become a Christian, and the way they define Christianity. And like you said, it's all couched very much like, this is the answer. It's an us versus them mentality. We have the answer and other people don't. And if you do leave, well, you're become a them. And like you said, you get ostracized and ignored because it does not fit the brand.
mhm. Yeah,
People
it
would
doesn't fit
see.
the brand, it doesn't help them keep followers,
Right.
it doesn't help them bring in new believers, it's you're really once you've sort of seen the light outside of it, you kind of become a little dangerous, um,
Yes.
and they do wanna I mean, I will say they did wanna drag me back in, definitely, like, maybe that was just where I was because I was in
Yeah.
New York City and there were kind of in compared to the rest of the populace, there were so few of us, and maybe because I was so weirdly successful in terms of, like, sort of getting into other people's brains because mine had been gotten into. Um, but yeah, it's
Yeah,
a
well, no, it's a phenomenon, and we're going to unpack that today as we hear more about your story. Um, so, give us some of your background. Did you grow up in a Christian family? I think we read about some dysfunctions in your family. What was that
yeah.
all like?
Yeah, I did not grow up in a Christian family. I grew up in this sort of like adjacently Catholic family. I would call my father described himself as a cafeteria Catholic. He sort of pick and chose what he wanted to believe, which is the big no-no in evangelicalism. You don't
Right.
pick and choose. It's all there in the Bible, aka their interpretation of the Bible. So I grew up, going to church sometimes every Sunday, sometimes not. It wasn't a big deal if we missed a Sunday, and honestly, the church community wasn't that big a part of our lives. It was just kind of something that we did, and my dad liked to sit in the front row and, like, shake hands with the priest because that was fun for him, and it was very embarrassing for all of us, but it wasn't like, "Oh, we have to read the Bible every night and do devotion," like, that just wasn't a part of my upbringing
Right.
at all.
Right.
My mom even said, my mom also grew up Catholic and, kind of brought us to the church. It was more sort of a let's teach the kids morals type thing, but it wasn't about making us believe anything. I think that they were always kind of like, they're going to believe whatever they're going to believe. Like the kids are going to believe what they want to believe. Like, but my mom, when, she was so not necessarily ascribed to one belief that she claimed that when she was 7 years old, she saw the ghost of my uncle
Right.
just died, come walking into her classroom and he was completely see-through. And was basically just mouthing words to her to let him know that to let her know that he was okay. Um,
Hmm.
and so it's like I was kind of raised in some ways Catholic adjacent, but a little witchy as well. It's like it was just a
Yeah.
sort of like there's a whole world out there and we don't know what
Yeah,
it is or
yeah.
what
There's
it
a
was.
spiritual world. Yeah,
Yeah.
they acknowledged all that part of it,
Mhm.
but they didn't have the theology and the doctrine
No.
of
No,
evangelicalism.
nothing. And my father even said, I remember as I was growing up, my father was pretty clear that he believed that, anyone could go to heaven regardless of what religion they were or what non-religion they were. Like he was
Mhm.
pretty clear that he felt that way. But my home was, of course, pretty dysfunctional, as I wrote about in the book. My mother did have a pill addiction problem when I was growing up, and that had a pretty strong hold on the way I came to see the world, which was that I didn't know how to see the world. You know, my mother's addiction was so severe, and it was also very tied to deep anxieties. I wasn't allowed to know my grandparents, my on my father's side. I wasn't allowed to know any of my family there. So we kind of like grew up in this really isolated bubble. My mom told me that if that, you know, my grandparents wanted to kill her and kidnap us, and my father would
Oh, really? Oh,
yeah.
jeez.
Yeah, my father would let them because, like, you know, they wanted all the like, basically, my father wanted their money. It was like a whole thing. It was a whole
Right.
thing, but it was all sort of like drug-induced kind of, like, issues, and but that was really hard for me to understand when I was 3, like, and I was being
Oh,
told,
right. Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
So, yeah, I mean, that's the kind of, I mean, uh, none of us grow up in perfect families. But
Nope.
there's always some level of dysfunction, right?
Mhm.
And so
Exactly.
we come into environments like college, but the more dysfunction, let's say, than not, the more susceptible you might be to, I don't know, Campus Crusade or
Yeah, yeah. Or even
some
if
church or
yeah, exactly.
someone who's got a message that I've got the answers for you. You know.
Yeah, yeah. For me, what I was looking for was I was looking for a functioning example of adulthood. I was just looking for somebody to tell me how to be a human in the world, because I felt like I was watching it had happened at home, and I didn't see my parents really being functioning people in the world. And I really wanted that for my life. I wanted to go on and have a home that wasn't I wanted to have children and have a home that wasn't socially isolated, and
Right.
I wanted my children to know their families, but I
Right.
also just wanted to, like, yeah, just feel like a real person in the world,
Right.
and when I saw Campus Crusade, without really knowing what they were, this is the other thing. I started to not only did they invite me in so voraciously, but I also just saw these really cool looking people who seemed totally completely normal, living in harmony together, family to family, friends to friends. There were so many people around. Like, after growing up so isolated and in sort of like, you know, in in my mother's anxiety, growing up in this loop of her anxiety, I saw Campus Crusade and I saw this whole Christian world, and I was just like, this is so alive. This is so alive. There are so many people. It's so beautiful in the amount of people in this, like, you know, in this group. But I will say, you know, we touched on, you know, you grow up if you grow up with any sort of dysfunction and you enter college, you're susceptible to it, to this kind of thing. You're also susceptible if you just had a really bad breakup and you had been
Oh,
with
right. Yeah.
4 years or something. You know,
Right.
there's so many people I know who entered Campus Crusade and entered these college faith groups that have all different sorts of stories. For me, it was a real family dysfunction. For other people, it was other bad stuff that happened to them, but that left them vulnerable to somebody coming in and saying, like, not only I have the answers, but I have a whole life for you over here. It was
Right.
literally handing you a life, a
Right.
social life, a whole world on a silver platter that you didn't even have to necessarily work to achieve or find yourself. You just stumbled upon it.
Right. So it sounds like you had some personal needs that you were kind of looking and hoping to meet. And then it kind of by accident, you came into Campus Crusade, or, you weren't searching out a Christian community, right?
Not at all. No, I wasn't searching a Christian community at all. I actually thought when I was in high school, I had this whole diatribe that I would go on about how the Bible was evil and, you know, had been used just as an excuse to commit wars and crimes and all this stuff. I had a whole thing that I would say to people. I did not I wasn't even necessarily anti-Bible, but I was definitely anti-fundamentalism. But
Right.
it took about a year for me to understand how fundamentalist these people actually were.
Well,
They
I
really hit
did
it.
notice that in your book that you would get you had this relationship with this woman named Kate, and you would get into it, and you were very naive about what they were all about in the beginning, right? It just took
Yeah,
a long time, like
yeah.
for me, for example, I already knew what it was all about because I had been in youth group and I had gone to a Jesus festival and all this stuff, and I hadn't k- given my life to Jesus yet, but I knew what it was all about. But you were very naive about it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I had no idea that, and they kept it from me very purposefully. They were feeding me information about what I was getting involved in and what they believed and all of that stuff very, very slowly. They really trickled it in. That the goal, which I know now because I, kind of came on the other side of it when I got into it and I was fully indoctrinated. The goal the whole time was to plant seeds in my
Yes. Right.
and water them and see them grow. And that planting of seeds was really just getting close to me. It was just getting close to me and making me reliant on those relationships, particularly with Kate. Kate became somebody who I wanted close to me no matter what, and I didn't really understand it
Yeah.
for a
Right.
long.
You got close to her.
Mhm.
So what are some of the tactics that they use? I mean, they obviously, befriend people like yourself, but they had some events. They had, you know, what they might call evangelistic events, but they didn't call them that to the outside, to outsiders. But what tactics did they use to get more people into the fellowship?
Yeah, so there's two different tactics. All the tactics that they use fall underneath two umbrellas that they would term them as. It was either initiative evangelism or it was relational evangelism.
Okay. All right.
Initiative evangelism to them was going out on the beach or just door to door or on a boardwalk or whatever with these little surveys that they would have in their hands. They called them I forget what it was. It was like basically they were surveys that had like 10 questions, and those questions would sort of gauge how spiritually open somebody was to hear
Right.
kind of
Right.
information. And the last question was essentially how much do you want to know God personally? And if they answered a 7 or above, you shared something with them called the Knowing God Personally booklet, which was essentially
Wait.
the quote gospel.
Wait a
Um,
minute. They didn't use the 4 spiritual laws anymore?
the 4 spiritual laws were in the Knowing God Personally book,
Okay.
AKA
All
the
right. Because
KGP.
that's what we use, that little 4 spiritual laws thing
Yeah, I think
that
that yeah, I
Bill
think
White
that
came up with.
it was definitely a part of the KGP
It
book.
was, all right, but it was
Yeah,
updated.
it
Okay.
was updated for branding purposes. There was, like, a
Right.
baby's hand on it. It was, like, a whole thing. It was like, "When you're born, like,
Yeah.
this is what God wants for your life, blah, 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 blah,
Right.
blah."
Right.
Um, but yeah, if they answered a 7 or above, you would share the KGP book with them. If they answered a 7 or below, you would be like, "Have a nice day," and move on because they didn't want you wasting your time. But so there was that kind of thing, the initiative evangelism, but also there were other events that they would hold, such as ice cream socials, or they would have movie nights where they would or pizza nights. Everything would involve free food just to get the college students to enter the room. The first goal was enter the room, watch the movie, just get your attention. The first
Right.
goal was get your attention, and free food was always the way to do that. Um, and then from there, they would either show a movie, something like The Chronicles of Narnia. They even showed Saved before, which is a movie that really makes fun of evangelicals, but
Oh,
they showed
really?
it before at a movie event. Yeah, and then started
Oh,
asking people questions about it. Like they would do anything just to start a quote unquote spiritual conversation because those spiritual conversations were what led to getting to know somebody on a spiritual level, and no matter how long it took, a conversion event, even if it took a year or 2 or 3, they
right.
didn't care. They were in it for the long game. It was all about, starting to get those relationships going.
Yeah. So they
Mhm,
had really thought through the strategy, it sounds like.
mhm.
I mean, some of
Well-oiled
the things.
machine, yeah.
Yeah, some of the things that you're describing were not what they would have done on my campus
Mhm,
in the 1980s or late 70s, but, some of them were. There were some overlap, but this is an updated version, more with the lessons learned in the past, more
mhm.
long term, still having events, but doing both, initiatives that get people hooked and then build the relationships, and then maybe after a few months or a year, try to convert someone.
Yep. They had really thought through the psychology of it over
Right.
the years, probably. They did definitely update it, and maybe even they updated it for the culture too, you know, the way in which culture changed. It's kind of interesting to think about it from that,
Yeah, it does.
you know?
No, it sounds very familiar because that's what people were always doing. We did that on the mission field too. How do you reach these Muslims? And there was all kinds of strategies that we came up with that were, you talk about it later on. You said, when in Rome, be like the Romans.
Mhm,
Uh, you 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 take on a little bit of the culture of the people you're trying to reach, so that it'll be more appealing to them and more natural and comfortable for them to get engaged.
mhm.
So, what were some of the things that there's a lot of fear mongering in this evangelism and evangelical theology. I mean, once you became a friend of someone, or you had a relationship and you start talking, okay, now I'm going to try to convert this person. This person is an 8 on the scale or whatever,
Mhm.
you know. Uh, what were the ways of leveraging that person to say, yeah, I do need to accept Jesus?
So for me, once how it worked for me was that I had gotten so close to Kate. Like, I
Mhm.
really, really, really loved her. I got to the point where I just wanted to be her favorite person, and I don't know if she could tell that or what. I really can't, like, account for what was happening in her head, but I can account for what was happening in mine. What I know is that the closer I drew to her, the further she pulled away. And it seemed like, you know, I could tell that I wasn't her favorite person, even though I wanted to be her favorite person. And it seemed as if like she like had made me very reliant on her and on her opinion and her thoughts towards me. And she kind of knew that I really, really valued her opinion. And she wouldn't give me the satisfaction sort of, and like kind of argued with everything I said. Everything I said became an argument. Like, even if I said, you know, the couch doesn't look good over here, that became sort of an argument. Like, and like I became very afraid to talk to her or share my opinion about anything, because it felt like she was gonna just like, you know, disagree with me and ask me like what was wrong with me psychologically for not liking the couch over there or whatever. And then it just got to a point where I wanted her to love me so much that the night that she really started sharing this KGP booklet with me and started to actually give me these 4 spiritual laws and talk to me about them, I kind of knew at that point in time, like, she wants me to do this. Like, this
Mhm.
is what she wants. Like, and I became sort of so again, like, she seemed like it's very hard to describe this. I guess it would take me days probably to describe this. But after growing up in such an unstable environment and being so unsure of myself and so not confident in myself as a result of that, she seemed like the most confident person I had ever seen in my life. Like,
Right.
he always said to me, "You're too
Yeah.
emotional. You're so emotional. I'm logical. I'm logical. I follow logic." And
Right.
so much of my, like, inner turmoil was because of how emotional I felt and how emotional I was, and I just wanted to be like her. I wanted to be logical, and I remember saying to her, "You know, when I was growing up, people used to call me ugly at school," and she said
Mm.
something to me like, "Well, people called me ugly too, and I just didn't believe them because I knew that God thought I was beautiful." Like, and it was
Yeah.
just kinda like she was like everything just rolled off her back. There was nothing that seemed
Yeah.
for her, and I wanted that so badly. I wanted that confidence. I wanted to be that logical and not emotional because I wanted to be at peace. I wanted to live in a peaceful way. I, like, both admired her and I loved her, and I like seeing somebody so confident and so, like, incredible in my eyes, somebody like that I had never met somebody like that before, it felt like.
Mhm.
I wanted to be just like her, and I also wanted to have her approval in everything I did.
Yeah, so
And so
that and that's what kinda drove you to be, "Oh, see, if I do what she says spiritually, maybe I'll become like her."
That, and also maybe she'll love me as much as I love her.
Exactly.
Like, I
So
kinda
there
had a
was
bit
a
of a crush on her too, like,
yeah,
and I couldn't understand that, like, when I
right,
was, 19 in, 2000 and, like, 6, there wasn't any, like, representation of bisexuals in the world, so I was just very, like, I didn't even know what that looked like, um,
right.
so yeah, it was very confusing, but it felt to me like when she presented those 4 spiritual laws to me, it felt like if I give in to this and
Yeah,
I try this, like, and I do this, she's going to love me more and I'm gonna become more like her.
right.
Therefore, I will find peace. I will
Yeah,
find mental and
right.
emotional peace.
So, on the other side of the coin, if you didn't do it, was she teaching you that Jesus is the only way, and if you don't accept him, you're going to hell as well?
Yeah, it that definitely was it wasn't as big a part of it as it was the logic, like, of everything. Like,
Uh-huh.
she didn't fearmonger me in terms of "You're going to hell." At that point in time, I don't think I would have responded as much to that level of fear. What she appealed to me with was logic and order of the universe. Like,
But yeah,
yeah,
right,
like, I had an emotional connection to her. I had
right,
a deep emotional connection to her. So that came first, and that was where the relational evangelism was really important. But then after I had that deep emotional connection, and it became so important for me to to get her approval and to also be as much like her as possible so I could get out of emotional and mental turmoil. Then it was like, okay, how do I rationalize this? And she gave me the way to rationalize it, which is that not believing in Jesus equals separation from God. Like, essentially,
right.
believing
Okay,
in Jesus is the bridge to God,
right. Yeah,
you know? And so it wasn't as much about God's gonna send you to hell because he hates you. It was more about it's just logical that people go to hell because without believing in Jesus as Lord and Savior, and if he's the bridge to God, you can't cross that. You just
oh,
can't.
I see.
Like,
Right.
it's just
Yeah,
logic. Like, it wasn't
right,
even as, like, it wasn't even as damning and as awful as it was just sense. It just became sense.
right. So you couched it in that way, so it seemed like common sense, but you
Yeah,
weren't necessarily thinking about, "Oh, what about all the people living in Africa who or Middle East
never heard
who are
of
Muslim or Hindu, and what about all those guys? Are they gonna go to hell because
it. Mhm.
they didn't become a Christian?" You
Yeah,
know?
yeah, eventually, I was thinking about that, and I honestly was at that point in time too, but
Yeah.
it was I had so much hope that, like, as I continued in my faith, I had so much hope that those people would become Christian in God's
Yeah,
plan, and
yeah,
that there would be missionaries that went out there and
yeah,
evangelized to them so that they could become Christian, that I kinda put it in the back of my head as a, like, it's God's plan who accepts him, and also, it's like these people will be reached if he wants them to be reached, which I know he does because he's a good and loving God and he's just
right,
and
yeah,
blah, blah, blah. So it was like, it was less about there's sort of a mind trick that's played on you too when you're in this movement where it becomes less about, oh, they're going to go to hell because they deserve it or because they don't believe in him. And it becomes more about, well, I don't know where ultimately they're going to go and I don't know what course their lives are going to take. So I'm going to blind myself to that and just continue on my own spiritual
right,
journey. God will probably get them at some point in time because this is just the truth.
right, right. Yeah, so, mind tricks are very common,
Yep.
but you did bring up one thing that was very interesting. I think you said something about, you had dabbled with Wiccans or something, and Kate was telling you that, "Oh, you gotta stay away from that. You might have the effects of, the devil might be, or demons or something might influence your life because of that." That
Oh,
was
yeah.
a little fear-mongering, wasn't it?
That was 100% a form of fear mongering. Yeah. But it was like, it was from a, yeah, that's interesting that you say that because I feel like it was from a point of making sure that I didn't stray in that my thoughts didn't stray in the wrong direction. It
Yeah,
was like, at that point, I think she knew, and the church knew, and all these people knew that I had, previously been interested in Wicca. And it was like, well, because and I had done a Wiccan ceremony at one point in time with, my friend's boyfriend where we walked counterclockwise in a circle and chanted earth, air, fire, water. I was 18. It was
Yeah.
just, it was something that I was trying out. And yeah, I remember she was very, she was upset about that. And I was like, well, I did it before I accepted Jesus, so it's not a big deal,
Right.
She's
Right.
like, well, just because you accepted Jesus doesn't mean that whatever demons came into you when you did that are gone. Like,
Wow. I
you
couldn't
may
believe
still
you
have
said
demons.
that. No,
Yeah.
that's fear mongering.
Yeah, yeah, and I was like, "Uh-oh," and
Right.
it's like we talked about what form demons take. Oh, demons take the form of making you feel bad about yourself or making it hard for you to do your Bible time and, all
Right.
the things that you generally struggle with as a human being, or
Right.
even just as an evangelical Christian trying to, like, fit this impossible standard and do these impossible things. It was blamed on demons, and there were so many ways that a demon could enter your life. For me, one of those ways was apparently through the Wiccan ceremony that I did when I was 18 with my friend's boyfriend. And that was just one way. But there was like so many different things that they did, yeah, to like scare you and make you think that yeah, that a demon had entered your life and you needed to purge it and that you needed to stay on the straight and narrow of only being within this community and only thinking about this community and doing your Bible study and just being fully indoctrinated. Like it was just
Well,
like
yeah,
being
that's the
completely
thing. You get to the point where, okay, you've done, you accepted Jesus, you've get bridged the gap, you're in God's family, but that's not the end. You've got to live, believe not a certain way, and also practice life a certain way, or else you might be influenced by the enemy, devils, demons. You might fall away, and
Yeah.
then you lose your salvation. There's all kinds of things like that.
Yeah, I
But
didn't even write about this in the book, but they also said to me at one point in time, I had somebody say to me like, "Oh, do you have a relative who's a Freemason? Have you ever had a relative who's a Freemason?" And I was
yeah,
like, "My mom's brother, who I never knew, and I
yeah,
didn't know him growing up, apparently he
right.
was a Freemason at one point in time." And it's like, "Well, because he's in your bloodline, you might have some demons because of that." And I was like,
Oh my
"Really?"
gosh, I had never heard that one before.
Yeah, 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 he was real wackadoo, that guy.
Wow.
He had
Right.
really gone off the deep end with some stuff, but yeah, I was
Yeah.
like, "I didn't even do anything, like, what the hell?"
I know, that's
It's not
really
fair.
crazy.
Yeah.
Now, one time you said, to someone, I guess you were trying to evangelize, you said, "You're believing lies. The truth isn't yours to decide."
Mm,
And that kinda struck me because that is definitely an attitude, you know, of evangelicals. We have the truth, other people don't. But how
mhm,
do they determine the truth? Well, it has to be biblical. It's gotta be in the Bible, right? And so
mhm,
if they decide something is not in the Bible, then it doesn't matter if it's illogical, it doesn't matter if it's harmful, it doesn't matter if it's violent even, it's the truth,
yep,
right?
just have to deal
So
with it, just gotta
yeah,
deal with it.
and it's really, I mean, it's kind of funny because you said Kate's so logical, but in one sense, they don't let you think, well, in a very real sense, they don't let you think for yourself,
Mhm,
right? If you come to a different logical conclusion, that's not acceptable, right?
mhm.
So why don't they allow just people to come to think for themselves and come to their own conclusions?
'Cause they can't control you that way. It's a high control group, like,
Mhm.
evangelicalism is something that I think a lot of people have referred to it before or like to refer to it as a cult, and what's funny is that a lot of scholars who study evangelicalism are like, "It's actually way too big to be a cult." It's a high control group. Cults are like little groups, whereas evangelicalism is this massive, massive high control group, and if you think for yourself, you cannot be controlled, like, you cannot do things you cannot be indoctrinated fully in the ways in which they want you to be. So it's like in some ways you almost have to hold certain it's also very complex and really 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 icky because they they hold evangelicals hold some beliefs that are just really, really rotten and awful, and that sound really rotten and awful, and in your heart are really rotten and awful. Like, such as, to me, one of the most rotten and awful ones was that it was, gay marriage was a sin.
Right,
That
right.
yeah, and I found that to be so rotten and awful, but at the same time, I felt like I had to hold it and I had to espouse it in order to stay in this group. And in that way, they controlled me even further because I was doing something that I knew was kind of wrong. I was believing something and espousing a belief that I knew was kind of wrong. And even going out onto, the beach and espousing these beliefs and saying these things, it was sort of like this like humiliation tactic. It humiliated me to do that. But if I did what they told me to do, then I was right in their eyes. I would get to keep this community. I would get to stay in this group and be in good standing in this group and get all this glory and all this praise and all this love and all of these good things within this group. But also because I stayed within their framework of belief and I did things that I didn't really like doing for them and I humiliated myself and held embarrassing beliefs. Like frankly, in this day and age to believe that being LGBTQ is a sin, it's embarrassing. That's an embarrassing belief to hold. But because
Well,
I
a lot of the things are embarrassing. The doctrine
yes,
of hell is embarrassing
it's
too
embarrassing.
when you
It's
unpack it.
embarrassing to believe that Jesus yeah, exactly. Like all of the things about Jesus, that he's the way and the truth and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through him, that all of these other people are going to hell. It's very, very embarrassing. But if you hold these beliefs and you embarrass yourself for them, they can control you that much more. Because then to get out of it, you have to come back and say, I was wrong. Like
Right, right.
humiliation is a very, very, very powerful high control
Yeah,
group.
it's shame. Yeah, it's a shame-based kind of a
Yeah.
community. You don't
Yeah,
wanna
yeah,
be
yeah.
shamed. So you
Nope.
got stay to the course, don't
Yeah.
rock the boat,
Yeah.
and if you are shamed, you have to be, say, "I repent, I was wrong,
Yes.
pray for
Yeah.
me," and then you're back in the fold.
Yeah, and you don't wanna be shamed in it, but you also don't wanna be shamed out of it. Like, one of the
Mhm.
hardest things about coming out of the movement for me was the shame that I had about the things that I had done within it. Like, I
Yeah,
had to go to all of my friends and be like, "Actually, I don't believe in any of this. I feel like a big dum dum. I feel
yeah,
pretty stupid
right.
for having fallen for this for 7
Yeah,
years of my life." Like,
yeah.
that was extremely hard to
You
do.
got
Yeah.
Yeah, you're okay. I was in it for 25 years, so
No shame
you're much
here, no
smarter
shame
than
on this
you're
podcast.
I mean, I actually I did what I call deconstruction light for many
Mhm.
years. So, I questioned a whole bunch of things, but I didn't say question it openly because I
Mhm.
knew, just how you said, I'd be kicked out of the community,
Yeah, yeah.
right? So,
Mhm.
it's kinda like this, you have 1 foot in, 1 foot out kind of a thing until finally you can't take it anymore. That's kinda what my experience was. But it
Yeah.
doesn't sound like you encountered, or they certainly wouldn't entertained, just an alternative view. Like, for example, hey, actually, there are some Christians who are gay and accept that being gay is okay. What is so bad about that?
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
whatever, and there's Christians who are universalists who believe
Mhm.
everyone's going to heaven. In the end, God's restorative, not retributive. What's wrong with that? I mean, did you encounter that, or what? When you did encounter it, what was their response?
That those people were heretics,
Yes.
like, actual heretics. Um, and, yeah, like, I remember, Mark Driscoll, so evil, such a bad guy. Mark Driscoll, him having a sermon in which he was very clear that if you are Christian, like, actually evangelical, and you believe that Jesus is the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except for him, you've got that primary theology down. But you also believe that being gay is not a sin, that gay marriage, the act of homosexuality, as they called it, was not a
Yeah.
sin. Not necessarily being gay in itself, you can overcome that, but the act of homosexuality, acting on
Right.
it is a sin.
Right.
Um, yeah, Mark Driscoll was just like, "Those people are heretics," and everybody, went along with that. Everybody was like, "Yeah, that's true. Those people are heretics." Whereas if you openly left the religion, you're an apostate. Like, you and I are apostates now. But, like, yeah, those people who espouse these Christian beliefs and these core Christian beliefs about Jesus being the way and truth and life, but don't follow these core tenets of the Bible that we believe are real, which is weird that like the act of homosexuality being a sin is like such a core tenet of the Bible now and of their belief system. Like, because it's like not actually all over the Bible. It's not like
No, no. I mean, when you unpack it, it's really not even taught in the Bible. There
no,
were other
it's
things
not.
going on, like shrine prostitution and,
Yeah.
using,
Yeah. It's very
homosexuality and the cults of the religions of the pagan religions of the day, etc.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, but it's become such a thing because the evangelical church, particularly the American evangelical church, is so deeply homophobic. They're so deeply homophobic. So it's become, but also a lot of eyes have been put on it because I think a lot of gay rights activists have put eyes on it, like being like, what's up with that? What's up with that problematic belief? Like, through both the Catholic Church too and evangelicals and all of that stuff. Like, there's very little tolerance, like, from the left and the progressive left about that type of stuff, as there should be very little
Right,
tolerance.
right.
It is, yeah, I forget where I was going. I'm like on a tangent
No,
right
that's all right. There's so many
So much to
trails
talk
we could
about.
go on. It's just there, and they're all connected too. You
Yeah.
mentioned Mark Driscoll. Mark Driscoll, for those who don't know, he was a mega pastor in the Seattle area, but he was so influential that you listened to him on a regular basis in New York. So, I mean,
Mhm,
even he had a whole network of churches he was associated with. He was really what we call the bully pastor, just
mhm.
berating people for not believing the right way, etc. And ended up getting kicked out of his church because he was a bully, and the whole denomination that he started folded. And unfortunately, he's still around and started a church in Arizona and is doing the same thing. So it's kind
Yeah.
of a whack-a-mole trying to get these things to stop. And my theory is that the reason why they don't stop is because of the underlying theology. If the
Mhm.
underlying theology is the same, then eventually that stuff is going to come up again, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it is the baseline. It's like it's sort of the natural conclusion of the theology. That's the thing that's so frustrating about someone like Mark Driscoll is he really is like when you really like dig down deep into the theology, he is kind of the natural. He's where it goes, you
Yeah,
know. So
yeah,
yeah,
it's true. Yeah,
he's onto
it's
something
the
there.
logical conclusion if you believe those things, right?
Yep, exactly.
So, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that, well, I would call them red flags, like little red flags go up and you start questioning things. And slowly, as you went through your experience in the book, it describes those things. Like one time, I think you brought your sister to a church, and I think they were more hellfire and brimstone preaching, but they also ignored you, and your sister was not impressed at all. This
Yeah,
is
my sister
weird.
was not evangelical, and my sister also had just been diagnosed with cystic fibrosis, and
Yeah,
"Oh my goodness, she's gonna die young." It was this whole thing, we were terribly
right.
worried about her, and I was terribly worried because I was like, "Not only is she gonna die young, she's gonna die young without meeting Jesus, and then she's gonna go to hell, and then what the fuck?" I was like,
Yeah,
"What
right.
do
Yeah.
then?" Like, and so I felt like it was very, very important to get her saved, and I started taking her to church. Yeah, and they just ignored us. They just didn't welcome us into their community. It really sucked, and it was a red flag moment. It should have been more of a red flag, but when I talked to Kate about it, who was, sort of my guide through this whole world, and in many ways, like another sort of God in a way to me, she was like, that's just how some churches are, and it's not right and it's not okay, but God's people aren't perfect. Like, God's people aren't perfect. You can't expect them to be. Like, you're not perfect, so God's people aren't perfect. Like, and I'm sorry that you had that experience. That really stinks that you had that experience. Like, but just come back to where we were. It was in New Jersey. I grew up in Mass, but went to college in New Jersey. Just,
Mhm.
back to New Jersey, like, we'll work it out. We'll get you to spiritually grow in these other communities that will be welcoming to you. And we'll just pray for your sister, and we'll continue to, pray for her, and you can evangelize to her when you're home for summer and winter breaks, and we'll get her to where she needs to be, hopefully. Like, and it was, yeah, I just honestly, it was still so about Kate at that point in time, and so
Yeah,
about,
right. For you were so wrapped up in that relationship.
yeah,
But
it was
that's
so
very yeah, that's very common. You encounter a church that's gives you a bad taste and it's a red flag. And a lot of times people just say, well, that church is messed up. I'm going to go down the street and find another one.
yep.
And then they might eventually everything there's a kind of a honeymoon stage where everything seems to be fine until something happens, and then you realize, no, there's some problems here too, and then you move down the street and you find, and then eventually at some point you realize, wait a minute, the whole movement is this. Not everyone is falling apart at the same time, but they're all eventually falling apart, it seems.
Yeah. There's something rotten at the core, right?
Yeah, right, right. Something rotten at the core, right.
Yeah.
So, but So what got you to start changing your mind about this? I mean, you're in it deep. You were actually very successful. Tell us a little bit about that, and then how you changed your mind. But you were a successful evangelist. You went to graduate school. You were in a church that was, I think, associated with Tim Keller. Is that
Yes,
correct?
yes,
Yeah,
Tim Keller's, Redeemer Presbyterian was sort of an offshoot.
yeah.
Also, Acts 29 Network, Mark Driscoll, they
And
were
that's
all
Mark
in the
Driscoll. They're all
area.
part of it, right? And so that, folks, was a very successful church in New York City. Tim Keller is a very famous evangelist, pastor, Calvinist, I think.
Yes.
But he's one of those intellectuals that defends the faith and everything. But you became a successful evangelist, and then at some point you started questioning things. What was going on?
Yeah, so in a lot of ways, it was like, uh, the design sort of backfired on them when it came to me. Campus Crusade was all about strengthening your faith and then going out and sharing it with others, and
Mhm.
strong enough to be in a room full of non-believers, but still hold your faith. Um,
Right.
and I will say that the more rooms of non-believers I was in, the more I started to question, and the more also my own desires started to shift. And I saw people living a life that I found I deep down really, really wanted to be living. And I was like jealous of them for being able to live those lives.
The
And
freedom you mean that they had? What are you talking about?
they just had freedom. Like,
Yeah.
there was something about just being like a hot mess express in your 20s that I kinda wanted to be, and I was a hot mess express in my 20s, but in a different way than they were. Like, I was over here trying to figure out who I was from a psychological perspective, within this high control group, and everybody else was, having one night stands and getting drunk and just being regular old human beings, and I could see that. It's like I
Yeah.
could see them trying out relationships for size and trying
Mhm.
on people around them, and I felt like I couldn't do that. I almost became just as isolated as I had become when I was growing up, and I didn't want that for myself, and again, because I was in New York City and I wasn't in, the Bible Belt or in this, I wasn't living in an area where everybody was a Christian. I was living in an area where nobody was a Christian and I was the only one. I, got very good at evangelizing and sharing my faith to people and in seeming really really normal even though I really wasn't normal, and making it look like my beliefs could be really attractive, and then slowly feeding them to people slowly so that they weren't fully opposed to it at the outset, and I could sort of get them more bought into it at different levels. Like I
Right, right. One
everybody
step at a time kind of a
Yep,
thing. Yeah.
yeah, I just did to everybody what had been done to me,
But
and I became really good at it.
yeah,
But
but what I noticed is that you were, sometimes you were in bars drinking wine or beer to evangelizing someone, and I thought to myself, "Wait a minute, I didn't get that memo when I was in university and all the churches that I went to through the years." Yeah, you couldn't do that, man. You
yeah,
had no if you drank alcohol, they said, "Keep it quiet. Only do it at
yeah.
home. Don't do it in
Yeah.
public."
No, in the New York City evangelical movement was way different. Like, Campus Crusade also didn't really want us drinking, when we were on missions trips and stuff like that. But if you were in New York City and you're at a New York City church, everybody drinks socially in New York City. It's a
Right,
big part of life in New York City is
right.
alcohol, bars, and is going out for a drink and meeting someone for a drink, not getting drunk all the time, but just like social
Yeah,
drinking is
right.
huge. That's what people do. And so if I was gonna do as the Romans do, I had to have a beer in my hand while doing it. Like, if you're gonna blend in and be able to successfully
Yeah,
convert someone, you gotta look like
and
them and you gotta act like
yeah,
them.
so you had a little bit of a justification because Paul said, to the Greeks, I became like the Greeks to win the Greeks over to Christ. So, you know, there's something about that makes sense. So you did it, but even
Yeah.
though most evangelicals would say, no, that's crossing the line,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, they would say that's crossing line, and
Yeah,
I did
right.
cross the line. I was crossing the line.
Yeah,
Like, maybe they were right. Maybe it all just led me down the tube,
right.
but, yeah, eventually what kind of happened is the more non-believer believing friends I got, the more I was seeing them, yeah, live lives that I was jealous of. I wanted to be a hot mess express like them. I wanted to have relationships like them. I wanted to be less socially isolated. But I also started to see people. I had a really good friend who, we were out to eat one night, and there was this incredible bottle of sake that we were given at the restaurant for free because her and
Hmm.
our friend worked in the restaurant industry, and there was
Hmm.
a man at the table next to us, who wasn't with us, and he was like, "Just want you to know that's like a really great sake. I've been trying sake all around the
Right.
city. I never
Okay.
had one, but that one, is absolutely amazing. It's top line." And she just, got up, got him a glass, and just poured a whole huge glass of it for him. He probably got drunk. But like, it's like she was just it was just her first instinct was, "Sir, you are having some of this. Like, I am not keeping this to myself." And I remember the teaching in the church had been, if you see somebody who's, seems like a good person,
Hmm.
but they're not a believer, that's not it doesn't really mean that they're a good person. That's just the imago Dei. That's the image of God.
Right. Right. Right.
And, that is, it's like everybody we were all made, even non-believers, everybody was made in the image of God, of the imago Dei. You're just seeing
Mhm.
the imago Dei. And I remember in that moment, it just for some reason, that moment really struck me because it was so generous and it was so kind. I was like, "This goes beyond the imago Dei." I was like, "This like, she did not need to do this." Like, she did not need to get up and give
Yeah.
him.
Well, as you wrote in the book, how could someone who didn't know Jesus love a stranger this way? I mean,
Yeah,
you were seeing it could be the Imago Dei, but it was outside the church,
yeah.
outside Campus Crusade, outside
It
Jesus.
seemed
So
so
how
far
do you
outside.
explain that? How do you
Yeah.
explain that?
Yeah, I couldn't. It's like I just started seeing so much beauty in so many people that
Yeah.
was so outside my reference point in terms of what Campus Crusade had been teaching me for all of those years. And honestly, it just got really, really, really hard to rationalize it all. Like, and to I kind of got to a point where I was just like, if this is not true, and also Kate was really far away from me. I got to a point where her and I kind of really separated
Mhm.
by just distance and life. She didn't move
Mhm.
to the city. She was living in another part of America, and she was just like, getting married and doing all of that stuff. And I was not. I was hot mess expressing it around New York City,
Hot mess express.
yeah, I was trying to save people around New York City. Um,
Okay.
and so her and I were, like, far enough apart that I wasn't being influenced by her anymore. Our lives just became too different. And instead, I was just around all of these other people and taking in their lives and their souls and relating to them and finding myself being so much more similar to them, but also finding them being so beautiful on their own
Mhm.
without
Mhm.
this religion, that it became really important to me all of a sudden. I was like, if this is not true, if evangelicalism is not true, if this isn't real,
Right.
I cannot keep giving my life to this. I can't. And
Yeah.
it became very hard for a very long time.
Right.
My deconstruction took about 2 years, and I was very unwell mentally throughout, like, the process before I
It's
finally
very
gave
tough. Yeah, it's very tough because yeah, you're just ripping out what you thought was so perfect about life and the truth
in.
and everything, and all of a sudden you've got to rebuild something.
Mhm.
So that's a good question. What did you rebuild? What kind of lessons did you learn, and what did you rebuild after coming out of it?
Well, I had to rebuild my whole identity. I had to, like, in some ways rebuild, like, everything down to the core of, like, the way I dressed. Like, because being a woman in the evangelical movement also equals, you can't wear clothes in a certain way, and you can't, it was just there was just a lot of control. There was an even different kind of control, like, over me as a woman. So, but I had to, really ask myself who I wanted to be in the world, what kind of person would I be that I could like? Because I
Yeah.
had kind of been in evangelicalism for 7 years, and that was never a question. It was not like, "Do you like yourself?" It was, does God like you?
Right.
Does Jesus like you? And Jesus is only gonna like you if you're made in his image, and you look like him, and you sound like him, and you're more and more like him. And
Mhm.
then it became like, well, do I like me? And what do I like? about a person, and how do I become a person that I like? And once I left evangelicalism, that was probably the biggest question that I asked myself, and it was something that I really had to spend many years discovering. Um, I felt like kind of a non-person at first, like I felt like the entire world was just passing me and I was standing still in it. It was this like very strange phenomena where I just felt stuck in 5 years ago in a way. Like it's like I just didn't feel current. Like it felt like I was like so far behind myself. Um but also I kind of had to dig deep and meet who I was on the other side of it, who I was before I joined evangelicalism, before I accepted Jesus that night with Kate. I kind of had to find that person again and shake hands with her and just be like, "Hey, this is who you are. This is what we've learned. Here's the 5% of things that we can take with us, which basically equals how to be a social human in the world. And here's everything that we have to let go of." Um, and it took a long time to also I became very obsessed with what had happened to me in some ways. Like I couldn't stop talking about it. I would go to parties and I would be trying to make friends and trying to
Well,
like,
yeah, that's very common. Yeah.
yeah, and I
I'm
just
still, we're both still talking about it
yeah,
probably.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Like now, luckily, like hopefully I'm not, it's like going on and on about it as I used to at parties and just
Yeah,
freaking out.
right,
I
right.
would be like, I was in a cult like for all these years, and people would be like, "Whoa, this girl's a lot." Um,
Right.
but yeah, hopefully I'm not that bad anymore. But I was for a little while, and so
No, no, you it's like you need that. It's like you're venting and you need to say it to people and you need to have people understand what you went through and say, "Yeah, I understand. You made the right decision," whatever,
yeah, look, here you are now on the other side of it. Yeah, and
Right.
you're
Yeah.
okay. You're here. You're
So,
safe even. Like
right. So
it
that
was
yeah.
weird
It
being
goes
in
away eventually. You don't have to say it, but it's still interesting to talk about because
mhm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. It is very interesting to talk about. And also, it's interesting to leave a movement that promised utter and absolute safety and like to then enter into a world that is just fundamentally unsafe and learn how to protect yourself within that, you know? There are
Yeah,
so many
right.
things. There are
Right.
so many things
So,
about
um
yeah.
So I'm curious, do you still have like an affinity to Jesus and his teachings? Or is it kind of like, you know what, I gotta leave everything. It was just too toxic for me.
I think that there's a little bit of, when it comes to I think I have questions just in general about who the hell Jesus was and whether or not he even existed. And like,
Right,
it's like what this person in the Bible was saying, and was that a guy named Jesus or was this five guys who wrote this together and workshopped it like, over some
right.
wine one night. But I do still hold dear the idea of doing unto others. Maybe
Yeah,
that's
right.
also, like, a big thing in my life right now because I have children, and there's a lot of, like, "Do I yell at you? Maybe you shouldn't yell at me." Like and, like, it's like
Right.
I'm sort of teaching them that, but I'm but when it comes to yeah, so it's just, like, in general, kindness towards each other, but even, like, that may be the only thing. When it comes to turning the other cheek, I don't really know if I believe in that or
Mhm.
believe in that protects or really helps anybody or really helps us get to a better world. Um, yeah, like and when it comes to even just faith in general, I will say that I, it doesn't really matter to me what the truth is about what happens after we die. It used to be the biggest thing that mattered ever, but it's kind of now after it being the biggest thing that mattered, it's kind of a relief to have it not matter anymore. So
Right. Well, I mean, faith deconstruction, you can go very deep into it, or you can just say, you know what, I just discovered these are harmful and I'm moving on.
mhm,
And and for some people, like myself, I really love history. So I went back and I looked at the history of Christianity and I realized, what we call Christianity didn't even exist the first 200 years.
mhm.
It's like
Yeah,
and these early followers, even Jesus, they didn't believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, and they were actually universalists, and they weren't hung up on all these other things. And so why are we? It's like And so, and also we realized that Jesus was actually against religion. I mean, he came down hardest on Satan and religion.
Yeah.
Right. So the religion that we have created in our modern world through the centuries, for the most part, is really nothing to do with the early movement of Jesus. It's
Mhm.
a whole new paradigm that's very interesting to
Yeah.
learn.
Yeah, it is interesting also from historical perspective. I feel like I've been learning a lot lately about Billy Graham and who's interesting, he's like an interesting person when you think of Campus Crusade too and all of these
Right.
movements and his relationship to those. But, in a lot of ways, Billy Graham has influenced our modern day understanding of evangelicalism and what it is and what it means to save people. And a lot of that was brought about by nuclear energy and the advent of nuclear energy and people feeling like they needed to be saved from, utter death and
Oh,
annihilation.
right.
It's like,
The threat of the Russians
yeah,
sending rockets over and bombing us, or
yeah,
nuclear
exactly. There
bombs. Right.
yeah, there are
Yeah.
direct correlations between
Yeah.
all of
No,
that
that's
stuff.
true.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so it's very fascinating, like, and I think that everybody owes it to themselves, especially people who are in the evangelical church, particularly people who are in the evangelical church, to look back and understand, like, where the stringency of their beliefs comes from and when that
Absolutely.
started from a historical perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
if they don't do that, and when they do that, they can really be set free from some things.
Yep.
So, folks, we've been talking with Beth, uh, the author of God's Ex-Girlfriend, a memoir about loving and leaving the evangelical Jesus. And I recommend it highly. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. Do you have a website or something that people can visit?
Yes, you can visit my website, gloriabethamadeo, .com. You can find me on Twitter at gloriousbeth. You can write to me on my website too if you wanted to reach out and say hi. And there's all the links to where you can buy my book on the
All
website.
right. We'll put that in the show notes as well, so you can go to her website and contact her. Beth, it's been a great conversation. Folks, this is a great book. I think you have a lot of insights. We just touched the surface in this conversation. You'll get a lot out of this book if you pick it up, grab a copy for yourself and read it. So again, Beth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And so until next time, everyone, on the Spiritual Brew Pub, enjoy responsibly.